I can just jump right into it if you want.
Do it.
We have this election that's coming up, and it feels as though, I mean, it's less than a month away. It's 3 weeks away. And
As
one of
we speak. Yeah, yeah. And people may be seeing it even sooner. So, yeah.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's terrifying, right? To think about the fact that the nation's future is going to be decided by millions of people casting their votes in just a few weeks. And so that led me to looking at, people often look at how different communities, racial and ethnic groups vote. And this year, of course, we could be seeing a sort of a rematch of 2016 in a way, where we
Hmm.
have potentially the nation's first female president going into an election, or a woman running as a major party candidate. If Kamala Harris wins in November, she'll be the nation's first woman president. And of course, she's facing the same person that Hillary Clinton faced in 2016. And what I looked at was a gender gap among voters, not just any gender gap, but specifically a gender gap among young voters, the people that we think of as Gen Z, Zoomers, roughly, the younger than millennials, but old enough to vote. And there is a kind of sharp difference that is emerging that I don't know if enough people are paying attention to. And that is that young women are overwhelmingly going leftward, and young men are significantly moving to the right in various ways. So if we look at it through the lens of the election, one of the latest New York Times Siena College polls found that among women aged 30 or younger, two-thirds plan to vote for Kamala Harris. Not surprising. In fact, I'm sort of surprised it's not even higher than that. Whereas over 50% of young men in that same age group plan to vote for Trump. And that is really fascinating. And it reflects a growing trend. Over the years, young men have basically moved away from the Democratic Party, and only something like a third of young men identify as Democrats now. And that's down from something like 40+% just 4 years ago. So that's saying something about the kind of social conditions and also the cultural shift within the country that in some ways is going hand in hand with the racial and demographic shift. But on the gender front, it's really, really fascinating. And I think there's lots of reasons for that we can get into.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about some of those reasons. You haven't written about it yet, but you sent me the source material. So I looked at it too. And the thing that struck me the most, I went from a couple articles that had been written back to the original American Survey Center study. And the flaw, it's not a major flaw, but I always get frustrated when surveys ask people if they consider themselves liberal or conservative, because I think they're increasingly meaningless terms. But the more concrete terms that you cited, which party are they going to vote for? Which party do they identify with? That has significance. I mean, I guess I'm a male and I wouldn't identify myself as liberal. I might interpret what they mean as a left-right axis I see differently. But, I worry about that part of it. But who you're going to vote for is a much more tangible question. And I wondered, looking at it, the drop off in people in men, particularly young white men, I think they were focusing on more than anyone else, who identify as feminist. I found that that might be the leading factor here, sort of dragging the others, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, behind it. I don't know what you think, but I felt that some of the interviews that the New York Times conducted, granted they're anecdotal, but it was plausible to me, this sense that young men, particularly working class, not college educated and so on, feel, and I'm not saying the feeling is right, but that they feel somewhat left behind and neglected, and so Trump attracts them. I don't know. What did you think of that
The
aspect of it?
term that I'm seeing used, and it's not a bad term. It's called, they're calling it social dislocation, which is that
Mhm.
young men, particularly working class men, men without college degrees, so men who have not necessarily received higher education on matters of society and why we have changing societies and how women were left behind and are now making strides, men who haven't received that education are feeling socially dislocated. They're feeling that the country is moving forward and leaving them behind. And a lot of it has to do less with power that they're losing and more with their relative power to women, their power relative to women. So with what women are gaining. So we have, women are entering the workforce in higher numbers than before, entering colleges and graduating at higher numbers than before. And although we continue to have a gender wage gap, and by the way, the woman who really made that a big deal, Lily Ledbetter, recently passed away at age 86, the gender wage gap is narrowing. So it has now been narrowed if you count all women. And of course, there's always a racial breakdown with white women earning the most. But if you add up all women, women are now earning 92 cents to the dollar compared to men, which is a narrowing of the wage gap. This is all leading to men feeling left behind. And as more and more women sort of push back against attacks on their right to an abortion, they're asserting themselves more. This is also driving men toward the church, young men toward the church. It was so interesting, Richard, by the way, just an
Right.
aside. Last week, I was sitting at my favorite coffee shop and I saw this young man, very friendly. He was chatting up a girl. Then he sat down and he was waiting for a friend, and another young man joined him. And I was just curious because he was sort of sitting right next to me. And they started getting into Bible study. Like they began their conversation with like a prayer. They're sitting out in the open in a public place in a coffee shop. They look like young, trendy Gen Z men. And they both had Bibles and they opened them up and started reading them. And I live in liberal Southern California. And it really made me think about the same poll that you were saying, which is actually run by the American Enterprise Institute, a very conservative think tank, showing that young men are increasingly going toward the Christian church at around the same time that young women are leaving the church in droves. And the fact that the Christian church represents such a strong gender divide, anti-abortion, not letting women be
Right.
ordained, and it is providing a safe home for young, disaffected, socially dislocated men. And I think that's kind of a scary thing for our nation's future.
Well, yes, and I think, if it's been a long time since I've gone to, Southern Baptist. I lived with Southern Baptist relatives as a teenager, but it's been a long time since I've been. But I'll tell you, they know how to make a person feel welcome, or they used to many years ago. I'm sure they still
Sense
do.
of community and belonging.
The community, the belonging. It's so good to see you here. Come back again soon. You want to stay for our social and so on. I probably call it something else now, but this mega churches, I've read about them in the sort of social economics of mega churches. They're great at this stuff. They've taken it to a science since I knew anything about it. And Sonali, I agree with everything you've said, but there's another dimension to this that I think often gets overlooked in this conversation, which is class. And
Yeah.
it's implicit in college education and so on. But the fact, for example, that women as a group are catching up to men, meaning that men as a group still enjoy a certain advantage, those are both aggregates. And so, 50% of the men on the curve are below the average, and there's a point at which those 50% of the men are below whatever it is, 40, 30% of the women, and a lot of them are struggling, and even some of the ones in the upper half feel that, well, life is a challenge for them because it's a challenge for every working person in this country. So I think what they see, one of my theories reading this, I want to get your thoughts about this, was when you see this decline in self-identified liberalism in this group, and when you see the decline in self-identified feminism in this group, it feels to me like two things are going on. One is that Democrats for the last decade or more have stopped making the argument for feminism and for some other forms of social rights and civil rights because they take it as a given.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if some of these younger working class white men, for example, just haven't heard the arguments, number one. And number two, you've probably heard my rant about how I hate the term glass ceiling because why are we vertically organized anyway? That's a reflection of inequality. So, I mean, I think that you mentioned the Hillary Clinton Trump campaign. I think Kamala Harris has wisely, just in tactical terms, stayed away from the whole glass ceiling pitch, but and really de-emphasized her identity, which is interesting. But to me, I think there's a whole cohort of working class men out there who think, well, what do I care if more women get on the board of directors of Raytheon or whatever? And what do I care if there are more women CEOs? I'm still struggling out here, and I don't see the Democrats care, or the liberals, or whatever they call them, or the feminists caring about me. I'm not
So, no,
defending that position, but I can see how someone would get there.
I see a very strong analogy with racial dynamics in this country. So, just as we've had a white backlash, a white conservative backlash against, in response to the fact that the nation is becoming more racially diverse, barriers are slowly, far too slowly, in my opinion, being broken down in terms of equality on wages and housing. It's still far too many communities of color left behind, but still better now than it was, say, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And in that same way, the sense of like, wait, I don't just have things handed to me by virtue of being white is applying to men. I don't just have, get things handed to me by virtue of being a man. There's this sense of backlash, of loss, even though, of course, equality to some means it feels like loss to others. So in that same way that men are thinking, well, why should I care if more women can be CEOs? A lot of white conservatives in this country have similar feelings. Why should I care about immigrants or Black people feeling equal when I'm the one who's struggling? And so we're seeing a similar backlash, I think, within the gender breakdown. But it's, for me, what's most interesting is that it seems quite specific to a younger generation. It's not something I would have expected, only because younger people tend to be less conservative than older
Right.
people, right? So traditionally, you see Gen Zers, and overall, Gen Zers are still less conservative than people who are older. But if you look at working class Gen Zers, there's a gender divide, and more men are becoming attracted to Trump's ideology. And frighteningly, this includes Black and brown men. And we're seeing Kamala Harris's support erode among Black and brown men. And unfortunately, it's unfortunate to see support for her as an arbiter of political ideology, because as you and I know, we don't think she's even nearly representative enough of leftist ideology, in the same way that Trump is very representative of extremist right-wing ideology. But still, you're seeing this divide. And I think because we don't have nearly enough people paying attention to some of the ways in which she is quite flawed on, say, the Palestine-Israel issue. She's actually quite right-wing on that issue, as Biden is. But it's so interesting to see young men of color lose enthusiasm for Kamala Harris.
See, and to me, the issue of young men of color takes me back to the economy issue that we the left in general, and certainly the Democratic Party, if that's left, has to develop a better vocabulary for speaking to economic issues, because I think that people do feel left behind. What's fascinating to me, by the way, looking at this study, generational and male female, is that Gen Z men in this are slightly more liberal than baby boomer men, within the margin of error, 25 to 28. But Gen Z women are almost twice as liberal, self-identified liberal, 24% among baby boomers, 24% of baby boomer women, 46% of Gen Z women. So there's been this progression certainly in social liberalism and maybe some other liberal ideologies too, and uh, and men are actually retreating. The peak of male liberalism was the millennials at 34%, now down to 28%. So yeah, I think I agree with you. There's something there, but I think it's very important to think about what this tells us about the limitations of identity politics if they're divorced from economic issues, of
Well, I think,
vocabulary.
when it comes to men and women, we cannot overstate what impact restrictions on reproductive justice
Hmm.
have, because it's not just about access to abortion. When you tell a young woman that she can't, that if if she gets pregnant and she wants to terminate her pregnancy, that it is the business of the state, you're not just telling her about
Hmm.
abortion, you're telling her entire being and her ability to control her entire body and health is at the whim of conservatives and lawmakers and the state. And that has a very big impact on the psyche of young women. And it's understandably so, in a way that I think young men don't have that impact to them. So reproductive justice is actually much broader than we think it is. It is much bigger than the access to abortion. It is about young women seeing, hang on, if today abortion, tomorrow what? How many children I can have? Monitoring my menstrual cycle, whether I have access to sanitary, hygiene, reproductive hygiene, whether I have, whether my cycle will be policed while I'm at work. What's next? And who gives anybody the right? How is it that the majority men are making decisions about my bodily autonomy? It is enough and more than enough to drive young women wholesale away from conservatism. So I think it's less about Democrats attracting women and more about young women fleeing conservatism, seeing it as being such an anathema, such like really striking them at the heart of their core. And where young men are concerned, they're feeling, am I needed in a
Right.
world I'm told that women don't need me? And if I'm not needed, what about my ability to just make a living? And so I think you're
Right.
very much right on this issue of the Democrats have a terrible time finding the right language for the economy and for economic justice. They need to do so much better on that. And they could, because their ideology, I mean their platform, their campaign, the Democratic Party's platform is more to the left of the words they articulate.
Right. And left in a way, it even includes elements of the left that would address the income and other problems of men as well as women. I mean, just overall, if the work economy for workers improves, it improves for men as well as women. I think you're absolutely right, Sonali. That's very insightful. But along with this rise in Gen Z women liberalism or left, whatever you want to call it, I hate the word liberal, there is this drop in male identification with the ideology. And I think it feels soft to them. And I think it feels, nurturing and caring, as George Lakoff would say, in ways that maybe they don't identify with. But I think it also comes to uh, the sense that they feel threatened. This old thing that, I scold the left for not naming the threats to the well-being and security of working families. And I think for men, what threatens their perception of community? Oh, dangerous people from outside, so immigration, so don't take away my guns, and maybe after listening to you also, I think probably how can we guarantee the reproduction of our tribe if we can't tell our women they must bear babies? I mean, obviously not an admirable sentiment, but it's one I doubt they even articulate. I think it's just a subliminal, well, these people make me feel powerless and I want to feel powerful. And here's a man who got shot and stands up and, I think it's such an important issue. And I think the left really has to figure out how to speak to it in a constructive way that's not, that says, no, the empowerment of women, all of this is good for you if it's done the right
I
way.
think I think that's why it's so important. And I think, those of us who count ourselves as not liberals but leftists, talking about things in terms of systems becomes really important because then it depersonalizes and de-individualizes problems. Instead of saying men are the problem, patriarchy is the problem, right?
Right,
And
right,
and and to say men are the problem corners them. To say patriarchy is the problem says this is a problem that we all struggle with that impacts all of us. How can we all solve it and fix it? So it's similar to the issue of race and justice. When we talk about racism being the problem, systemic racism, institutional and structural racism that's baked into the system is the problem. It allows for and enables, when we use that language, it allows for and enables individuals to see their collective liberation in the dismantling of harmful systems and structures, and then they can see themselves as part of the solution. So I always come back to this idea of systems, and that becomes hard at election times because election times gets turned into personality contests, popularity contests. It becomes about individuals and whether you like this candidate or with what this candidate represents as a woman or as a man or as a brown or black person or as a white person, whereas we really need to start talking about systems. Now, there's power in
right.
symbolism, and there's a lot of power in symbolism, but systems we cannot, and Democrats hate talking about systems because Democrats have bought into the idea of individualist, rugged individualism as well, even though they don't really want to admit it, but they very much buy into that idea. And then it becomes about individual power, but it should be about systems.
Right. And the way that this system even oppresses you, Mr. Young White Male, this is, I mean, look, we've had it for 200 years. How's it working out for you? If you don't like it, if you don't like the way things are now, maybe you want to think about,
Right.
uh, because it's not great for men. I mean, Susan Faludi and
And
others have written about this, feminist writers. The patriarchy is a trap for men who are working class and not, you know,
and men do care about women. They care about their
of
wives,
course, yeah,
girlfriends. They care about their mothers. They care about their daughters if they have daughters, right? There's nothing like having a daughter to turn a man into a feminist. Often you see, and in recent years, especially among Gen Xers, and millennials who are young fathers, adopting the moniker of girl dad as a matter of pride when they have daughters is a good thing. And so I think making that argument would Democrats would do well to embrace that idea that patriarchy is bad for us all, and combating patriarchy doesn't mean leaving men behind. It means lifting all boats and working for equity for all. So
we depend on your support here at the Zero Hour. So please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.